Chapter 21, Section 3, Interactive Reader, pages 321 through 324, or 13 points. Weather instruments. Key ideas. As you read this section, keep these questions in mind. What are 4 instruments that measure conditions in the lower atmosphere? How do scientists measure conditions in the upper atmosphere? How do computers help scientists understand weather? Page 321. Name 2 conditions scientists measure when they observe weather. What happens to the liquid in a thermometer when the temperature rises? How do scientists observe weather? You may have seen scientists on the news talking about weather. Highlight. Scientists who study the weather are called meteorologists. Meteorologists study weather by, highlight, measuring atmospheric pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speed, and precipitation. They use special instruments to make these measurements. Highlight. They use the measurements to forecast or predict weather patterns. How do scientists measure conditions in the lower atmosphere? Highlight. Meteorologists can predict weather patterns by studying conditions in the lower atmosphere. Scientists may use instruments to measure these conditions. Question 1. Name 2 conditions scientists measure when they observe weather. You can name any of the following: pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speed, precipitation. Again, pressure, humidity, temperature, wind speed, precipitation. Air temperature. Highlight. A thermometer is an instrument that shows temperature. One type of thermometer has liquid inside a glass tube. Highlight. The liquid rises and falls with the temperature as shown below. On the left-hand side, temperature change, increase. Highlight, increase. On the right side, highlight, liquid expands and fills more of the tube. Decrease. Liquid contracts and fills less of the tube. Highlight. Another type of thermometer is an electrical thermometer. Continue highlighting. This thermometer uses changes in electrical currents to measure temperature. Continue highlighting. A thermistor is a type of electrical thermometer that responds very quickly to temperature changes. For this reason, thermistors are useful where temperatures change quickly. Question number 2. What happens to the liquid in a thermometer when temperature rises, expands, and fills the tube? Again, expands and fills the tube. Page 322. How can scientists use a barometer to predict weather patterns? How would scientists describe the direction of a westerly wind in degrees? How does a radio sonde travel to and from the upper atmosphere? Air pressure, wind speed, and wind direction. Highlight. An instrument called a barometer detects atmospheric pressure or air pressure. Changes in air pressure can affect air masses. Highlight. A decrease in air pressure usually means that a front is approaching. Highlight. An instrument called an anemometer determines the wind speed. A typical anemometer has, highlight, small cups attached to a center pole. Continue highlighting. The cups spin as the wind pushes against them. Continue highlighting. This spinning motion sends a signal that records the wind speed. Continue highlighting. An instrument called a wind vane shows wind direction. Continue highlighting. Most wind vanes are arrow-shaped tools that turn freely on a pole. Continue highlighting. The wind blows the wind vane to point in the same direction as the wind. Continue highlighting. Scientists may describe wind direction using one of 16 compass directions. Continue highlighting. Scientists may also describe wind direction in degrees as shown below. North, northerly. Description using degrees, 0 degrees. East, easterly. Description using degrees, 90 degrees. South, southerly. Description using degrees, 180 degrees. Highlight. West, westerly. Highlight. Description using degrees, 270. Question number 3. How can scientists use a barometer to predict weather patterns? They can look for decreases in pressure. They can look for decreases in pressure that happen before a front. That happen before a front. Again, they can look for decreases in pressure that happen before a front. Question number 4. How would scientists describe the direction of a westerly wind in degrees? Answer, 270 degrees. 270 degrees. How do scientists measure conditions in the upper atmosphere? Highlight. Scientists study conditions in the upper atmosphere to better understand local and global weather patterns. Scientists use many instruments to measure these conditions. Highlight. A radio sonde is a package of instruments that rises into the upper atmosphere on a balloon. It measures conditions such as, highlight, humidity, air pressure, and air temperature. The radio sonde, highlight, sends the measurements as radio waves to a receiver. Continue highlighting. The receiver records the information. Highlight. Scientists track the path of the radio sonde balloon to measure high altitude winds. Continue highlighting. When the balloon reaches a very high altitude, it expands and bursts. Continue highlighting. The radio sonde falls back to the Earth on a parachute. Question 5. How does a radio sonde travel to and from the upper atmosphere? To the upper atmosphere on a balloon. To the upper atmosphere on a balloon that bursts at high altitude. That bursts at high altitude and falls on a parachute. And falls on a parachute. Again, to the atmosphere, to the upper atmosphere on a balloon that bursts at high altitude and falls on a parachute. Page 323. Why are satellites useful for tracking hurricanes? Where was this hurricane located? Radar. Highlight. Radar stands for radio, detection, and ranging. Radar, highlight, uses reflected radio waves to measure the speed and location of objects. For example, water particles in the atmosphere reflect radar pulses. Therefore, radar can find precipitation and storms. One kind of radar, highlight Doppler radar, can show the location, movement, and wind patterns of a storm. Weather satellites. Weather satellites carry important instruments that collect information about the atmosphere. Highlight: in some regions, scientists cannot observe weather from the ground. Satellite images can give weather information for these regions as shown below. Satellite cloud images can help scientists measure wind speed and direction at the level of clouds. Satellite images of infrared energy can check cloud, land, and ocean temperatures at night. Satellite instruments can also measure sea conditions such as currents and waves. This satellite image shows, highlight, Hurricane Wilma in 2005 as it approached Florida. Computers. Highlight: before computers, scientists had to solve difficult math equations to describe weather patterns. Now scientists use powerful computers to understand weather. Highlight: these computers can solve equations and store weather data from around the world. Computers can also, highlight, store weather records from the past. Computers help scientists to constantly improve weather forecasts and better understand the atmosphere. Question 6. Why are satellites useful for tracking hurricanes? Hurricanes are so large, it would be hard to track them from the ground. Again, hurricanes are so large, it would be difficult, hard, to track them from the ground. Question 7. Where was this hurricane located? Florida, Gulf of Mexico. Florida, Gulf of Mexico. Page 324. What are 4 instruments that scientists use to measure conditions in the lower atmosphere? What are 2 types of thermometers? Describe how each determines temperature. What is the difference between an anemometer and a wind vane? Name 3 instruments scientists use to study the upper atmosphere. Describe how one of the instruments helps scientists learn about the upper atmosphere. How do computers help scientists understand weather? Think of weather instruments discussed in this section. How would weather forecasts be different if scientists did not have these weather instruments? Question 1. Thermometer, barometer, anemometer, wind vane. Again, thermometer, barometer, anemometer, wind vane. Question 2. Liquid-filled thermometer, liquid expands to fill tube, liquid thermometer, liquid expands to fill tube, electrical thermometer, reads electrical charges. Electrical thermometer reads electrical charges. Question 3. Anemometer measures wind speed. Anemometer measures wind speed. Wind vane determines the direction of wind. Wind vane determines the direction of wind. Again, anemometer measures wind speed. Wind vane determines the direction of wind. Question 4. Radiosonde, radar, weather satellites. A radiosonde carries multiple instruments. A radiosonde carries multiple instruments to measure humidity, air temperature, and pressure. To measure humidity, air temperature, and pressure. Again, radiosonde, radar, weather satellites. A radiosonde carries multiple instruments to measure humidity, air temperature, and pressure. Question number 5. To solve equations and store data. To solve equations and store data. Question number 6. Scientists would be more dependent on observations of events in the atmosphere. Again, scientists would be more dependent on observations of events in the atmosphere.